All right, my dear colleagues, I'd love to introduce you to Samantha Godwin. We've actually run into each other on various occasions because we often are on the same collaborative research network, the Feminist Legal Theory one, and sometimes the Family Law one. So Samantha is an excellent scholar. She comes to us from University College London, where she earned a BA and an MA with distinction from the philosophy department, Georgetown University Law Center, University of Cambridge, and Yale. So she's on her way to JSD after having earned an LLM in 2015. Her work is very exciting and interesting, and I will go ahead and turn it over. You can look at her CD. I circulated it earlier, along with the draft of her job type piece. So go ahead and welcome Samantha.
Hey, well, thank you so much for having me. This piece is going to be on driverless vehicle collision programming, meaning what do driverless vehicles do when they can anticipate a collision? They can't prevent one necessarily, but they have some options about what to run into or to run off the road, or so on, which I think have some really cool legal, ethical, and philosophical dimensions to them. So we have this interesting dilemma where currently automobiles cause millions of deaths, 1.2 million deaths every year around the globe, according to the World Health Organization. So we're just living with a very significant, possibly reducible type of public health hazard. And at least 90% of these accidents are thought to be caused by driver error rather than mechanical failure or road conditions or problems that would be unavoidable with perfect steering. But we might anticipate that a sufficiently advanced driverless vehicle system, of which none currently exist, of course, but which we might anticipate existing in the future, could eliminate the great majority of these driver error-based collisions. So even with perfect driving ability, however, there are still going to be instances where collision is unavoidable, whether it's because of mechanical failure, whether it's because of different adverse road conditions. And the real set of difficult questions, I think, are likely to arise in a transition period where you have a mix of driverless vehicles and manually driven cars on the road at the same time, where you also have cyclists and pedestrians on the road at the same time, a system where your entire transit is centrally automated will likely have far fewer opportunities for accidents, but that doesn't seem to be the most likely pattern of technological development that we're likely to see. So there's a concept that a number of people have developed of inevitable collision states, where colliding with some object is going to be unavoidable, but there will be options as to what object a car collides into. So these are really uncommon among current automobiles because, again, they're mostly up to user error. But if we have driverless vehicles that perform at a much greater reliability than manual drivers, a much larger proportion of the accidents are likely to be in what are near inevitable collision states. And of course, nothing's actually going to be a 100% inevitable. We're talking in probabilistic terms here. So One of the interesting features is that although the adoption of driverless vehicles would have the potential to save millions of lives and radically reduce the number of injuries from cars, they would also have the effect of causing those instances where people do die or have serious injuries to be traceable to predetermined choices by their programmers in a way that you wouldn't have the same type of attribution for a manual motorist, because while a manual motorist makes a split-second decision that they can't execute perfectly, the collision behavior of the driverless vehicle is likely to be either directly or indirectly determined by its programmers, and that might be through act or omission. So choosing to avoid making some choices is itself a choice that's going to have risk distributive effects. What to me this implies is that we have a dilemma where there's both a moral necessity in encouraging the development and widespread adoption of driverless vehicle technology that exceeds human capabilities. But once that's been accomplished, the responsibility for those accidents that do occur will be much greater because the precise factors that went into the steering decisions can be assessed and will have been considered with the luxury of time rather than in a split-second case. So the result is that we hold human drivers to a certain standard because of human limitations and because we can't see inside people's brains. We could see inside the code governing driverless vehicle collision behavior. So we both have an opportunity to regulate, and we have a sort of greater moral culpability if the principles guiding this behavior aren't justifiable. So the main two questions are who should decide what principles govern driverless vehicle collision programming, and what should those principles be. So driverless vehicle inevitable collision states present one of the few cases where a famous philosophical thought experiment is likely to have a real-world analogy. So the trolley problem, of course, where you have different variants of decisions between how to direct a trolley to either kill 5 people or 1 person, according to whether the say trolley is already on the path to kill the 1 or to kill the 5, and many other variants developed by Philippa Furt and Judith Thompson has been very thoroughly analyzed for decades, and there have been a lot of sort of philosophical, psychological experiments about what people's intuitions are about that. But most of those problems involve asymmetries in numbers or the using people instrumentally. So if you tell people that trolleys on a course to collide with 5 people, but you can redirect it to collide with 1 person, the great majority of people will just adopt a utilitarian framework and say you throw the switch and have it run over the 1 rather than the 5. But if you tell people instead that they have the option of pushing a heavy person into the trolley's way such that the trolley stops before it can reach these 5 people, but it will kill that one person, then people's intuitions tend to reverse. And it seems like that's driven by instrumentalizing the one person. There's this fascinating thought experiment, though, by Jason Miller called the tunnel problem that strips everything down to a simpler scenario for driverless vehicles. So this is a case where a driverless vehicle is approaching a tunnel with mountains or insurmountable barriers on both sides at a speed where it can't stop very quickly. And a kid walks into the road. Now, either the car can swerve, which will kill the occupant, or the car can go forward and kill the kid. So the way that that Miller considers this is just as a decision about who should get to decide how to resolve those cases. But to me, I think that it sort of lets us off the hook too easily. We can't just talk about who decides. We have to talk about what type of decisions we as a society would best like to live with. So to use an illustrative example, this is a screen capture from the Moral Machine set of experiments by the MIT Media Lab that you can find online if you type in moralmachine.com, where people play with different preferences about whether you would want the car to be designed to run over the pedestrian and spare the person in the vehicle, or crash into the immovable object and kill the person in the vehicle but spare the pedestrian. So a lot of the sort of initial questions are likely to be whether a driverless vehicle ought to favor people within the car at the expense of people outside of the car when their risk interests come into conflict. So I've termed the former occupant favoring behavior, where the idea being that an occupant would be prioritized over a non-occupant merely because they are an occupant, versus programming that you could call occupant indifferent, where different factors might be considered, but there's not a thumb on the scale in favor of the occupant themselves. So what I suspect is the following. If we just leave this problem to the industry or to consumer choice, then we're likely to have this collective action problem, where if you want to maximize your own safety, you are best off selecting an occupant favoring design, since that will, if that's the only point at which you can make a decision, gives you the best results in a collision. But if you could choose to regulate a rule for everyone, a rule of general applicability, you would want occupant indifferent designs, because occupant indifferent designs that are intended to minimize overall fatalities and overall injuries would make you, would allow you to be safer even if your vehicle and all of the other vehicles are occupant favoring. And certainly if you're also going to be around roads as a pedestrian or a cyclist. So it seems to me that this is a problem that ought to be resolved by central regulation, because if we don't use regulation, we're going to have a result that most people are not going to favor, but that will follow from the incentives of consumer behavior to the industry. The question of when to regulate, I think, is before advanced driverless vehicles are available. If we wait until after they're available, we will already have established expectations and norms about what's appropriate and what people are allowed to do. So on reflection, there are, I think, really good arguments against permitting SUVs, in that an SUV colliding with a sedan, it has more than a 3 times greater likelihood of killing the sedan occupant than a sedan colliding with a sedan. And the odds are even worse for pedestrians. But people like SUVs, they make them feel safe. They're not actually especially safe, but we have that as part of our cultural expectations already. So there were a bunch of possible options, some of which are more implementatable than others. So the first option is what officially all of the driverless vehicle developers are trying to do, which is to just not hit anything. But we'll want them to be able to discriminate between occupied and unoccupied driverless vehicles, because we want a driverless vehicle that has passengers to sacrifice other driverless vehicles that don't have passengers in order to preserve the lives of the people on board. Whereas we'll want a driverless vehicle that doesn't have any passengers to sacrifice itself for vehicles that have human occupants or people on the road. So we're also really likely to be able to tell how many people are in each vehicle if we have the capacity to tell what vehicles are occupied and which are unoccupied. This is often described as being a problem for tort or insurance law, but in a lot of ways, these are fields that are quite inadequate for addressing this type of problem. So with tort law, you have no real negligence opportunities because the person operating the vehicle is not going to be breaching any duty, since they haven't, they don't have control of the vehicle's behavior. If we have a strict liability rule, then we're creating a scenario where the safer behavior carries greater liability than the riskier behavior of operating a manually driven vehicle, which gets the incentives wrong and is contrary to the way that we ordinarily do strict liability law. And then a no-fault insurance system tells us who should pay for it, everyone, through insurance premiums, but it's not going to tell us how we should actually allocate the physical risk, which is going to be more important to many people than the monetary questions. So Patrick Lynn and a bunch of other people have defended the view that driverless vehicles actually should be occupant favoring, in part because there's an expectation that you have, if you're in a car, it should have almost a duty of loyalty to you. And I would add to these arguments that manually driven cars have the luxury of prioritizing their own safety. So it would be in a way, it's a little perverse to say that a driverless vehicle has to be occupant indifferent when it's already reducing the risk to other people. Why should they have to further reduce others' risk by occupant indifference? There's also a question about whether an occupant indifference system might disincentivize uptake when we will really want to have these technologies developed and adopted in a widespread manner for all of the public health benefits that would follow from them. I think these arguments are not actually very effective, because the reason why we permit motorists to favor themselves isn't as a result of the sort of reflective judgment of policymakers or a democratic discussion. It's because we don't have the technology to either monitor or control their behavior. They're in a car steering themselves. So it doesn't follow from the fact that we wouldn't impose that regulation because we can't on manually driven vehicles, that we wouldn't want to do that for driverless vehicles. Moreover, I think because these are going to be in part predetermined decisions, that exposes them to greater culpability, whereas human drivers, again, will have excuses unavailable to programmers of driverless vehicles. So just briefly, if you allow people to program their own vehicles, there are potentials for them to do it in a discriminatory way. If you look up the MIT Moral Machine, people have actually quite strong demographic preferences about who they'd like to save and who they wouldn't like to save. So that's probably something we shouldn't do. And then the sort of standard rational system is to have a utilitarian decision where you just design a closed-in program that minimizes overall fatalities and doesn't regard any other factors. There are a few problems with this, I think. First, there's a fairness problem in that in other areas of life, we don't require people to take up the interests of everyone else as absolutely equal to their own. And there are also exploitation possibilities. So if a motorist knows that a driverless vehicle is going to brake sharply if they cut them off, they're much more likely to cut them off than to a manual driver who might rear-end them. There's also a funny possibility that if you have a truly utilitarian system that's indifferent to how people are behaving, two people jumping in front of a driverless vehicle could reliably kill its occupant if there's enough time for it to swerve into something, but not enough time for it to stop, which doesn't seem like a desirable programming system. So what I'm trying to add to this conversation is that we should have what I'm calling incentive-weighted principles to govern driverless vehicle behavior in collisions. So as a basic principle, we want people to internalize their own externalities rather than offset the dangers they create onto others. So what this means is that it would be in some ways unfair to expect a driverless vehicle user to take on additional risks vis-a-vis a manual driver who can prioritize their own safety, having already reduced the overall risk that they pose to others by opting into a driverless vehicle rather than driving themselves around. So in that regard, you could have a tie-breaking mechanism where you have equal numbers. It would be reasonable and appropriate to prefer the driverless vehicle occupant to a manually driven vehicle. However, if you have driverless vehicle versus pedestrian or cyclist scenarios, well, then if you were to pick what type of transportation option, if generalized, would be the safest for everyone and produce the best public health and environmental outcomes, you want people to be walking more and cycling more. So it wouldn't be fair, so to speak, for the driverless vehicle user to offset their risk onto a cyclist or pedestrian. So that's sort of my proposal and analysis of the problem so far, but I'd really love to hear what everyone thinks about it. I know that I've gone through a lot pretty quickly, but I see that I've gone over time, so I don't want to continue rambling. Yes?
This is interesting. What about the feelings of pedestrian. And so I was sitting here thinking, if I'm going to get hit, and the chances are that I'll be very badly injured, is there a way the car could speed up so that I'd actually, instead of being really badly injured, die?
Oh, wow, I had not considered that. So
People don't think that weirdly, but I do.
Yeah.
Well, you've had a year.
Exactly.
okay, so having not considered that at all, it is an interesting question, because a lot of people might really say that they prefer to be killed rather than maimed, or say killed instantly rather than die over 5 hours or something, which is, a really likely scenario in automobile crashes. I think when it comes to designing rules of general applicability, which again I think you'd have to do, since there's no way to read the mind of the pedestrian, and we can't, I guess you can imagine people, say, wearing identification badges that these vehicles can read, that either say, I'd rather be maimed than dead, or I'd rather be dead than maimed. But to me, this sounds like more like a problem of implied consent, where a patient comes into an ER unconscious and at risk of dying without an intervention. You can't restore them fully, but you can stop them from dying. The ER physicians are both entitled and expected to assume that, absent contrary information, absent a do not resuscitate order, this person would rather be saved than allowed to die. So I think you would probably likewise assume that people will prefer the least bodily injury possible. But I mean, that's obviously not going to satisfy everyone's preferences.
Of course, I have another one. Sorry, Bruce. What about just doing it based on age and saying, we're going to hit an 85-year-old, and the 85-year-old has, I know, I'm bizarre, has had a full life, and you've got a teen who's driving the car, who's in college, and you think it's better for the U.S. or better for the economy in general for the teen to live rather than the 85-year-old.
Yeah, so that's a great problem as well. It's one that I didn't have time to address in the presentation, but I talk about it in the paper in the section on one way of doing utilitarianism in design is to use quality-adjusted life years, the way that many public health organizations do, rather than total fatalities. I think there is a strong argument to be made on both sides. To me, one of the problems with that type of model, if we use the full quality-adjusted life year model, is that you have a type of discrimination against disabled people whose years of life are going to be undervalued. You might say that a preference for a teen over an 85-year-old, which is, by the way, a preference that's very strongly expressed in the moral machine respondents with regard to babies, but not necessarily with regard to children and old people, which is interesting. If you have that preference, although I think that would be, in a lot of ways, like the utilitarian solution, we're not a society that adopts strictly utilitarian regulations. We're a society that has deontological side constraints based on the rights that we think people are entitled to as a basic part of our morality. So it seems to me that even if you get more years of life by doing an age-based preference, that's something that you would want to consider but reject, because to accept it would to suggest that the lives of older people are less valuable than the lives of young people. And I think that would be an affront to people's dignity that would override the say, economic knock-on benefits of saving a young person rather than an old person. Yeah.
I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about the potential role of the tort system in the future world of intelligent automated driving. Your thesis is really interesting because you seem to be combining normative perspectives about the ethical choices that should be made when automated cars are confronted with these dilemmas, but also systemic because you're talking about where we should look for regulation of those choices. You seem to suggest that some sort of legislative or administrative model would be superior to the tort model because these systems don't fit the existing doctrinal models of tort law well. My concern is based in my skepticism that we're ever going to see how and why these choices are made, because my understanding is that these automated vehicles are going to be developed and deployed by private companies, Google, Apple, with significant marketing governmental power. And my anticipation is that they will work very, very hard to protect these algorithmic choices from transparency under claims of proprietary interests. And I think we've seen countless examples of that kind of thing happening. The only real analogy that comes to my mind for this kind of regulatory system would be the FAA with air travel. We are seeing more and more automated control of airplane behavior. But I think with the MAX 737 episode, we're seeing that the FAA has been increasingly deferring to corporate decision-making over how to make these choices, to some significant disaster recently. And I'm wondering whether the benefit of the tort system in this world of ethical choices that will need to be made is that tort lawyers are pretty good at using that system to look under the hood, so to speak, to see how and why these choices were made. I'm thinking about tobacco litigation, the recent Monsanto Roundup litigation, because we never would have known what was happening and why, what stuff was being put in there and what choices were being made if it wasn't for tort lawyers putting sunshine on it. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about whether the tort system maybe could be important here, maybe become critical if our regulatory system is not inclined to force the private sector into that kind of transparency.
So my thought here on this project is we're thinking not what's going to happen in the next 2 or 3 years. We're thinking about what's going to happen in 15 to 30 years maybe, or maybe 10 years. It's hard to anticipate what the political climate would be then. It's certainly true that if we have a government that has decided that it will defer entirely to all trade secrets claims and it will just allow an industry to regulate itself, then the only recourse is likely to be a tort lawyer who will depose some of these programmers and get them to say what the factors that went into their decisions were, get the code analyzed by someone who can run it through a million simulations and figure out what distributive effects it'll have. Those types of options, I think, would be the way that you would do it if you have an uncooperative government. So in a way, this is an exercise in what you might call not ideal theory, but not totally like on the ground policy oriented real world what's going to happen if Mitch McConnell lives forever type of sorry if that was inappropriate type of
I get you. There's a premise of some governmental optimism at some point in the future driving your nails.
But I mean, of course, if they
I wish I could share it.
well, it's not necessarily optimism. It's more like if you have the ability to do this, you should think about what you should do. The initial question of who should decide is going to be answered in some way, and we should be able to say after it's decided how they ought to decide, and this is a proposal for doing that. But I entirely agree that like the tobacco litigation is a fantastic example of how private civil actions can bring to light information that the government wouldn't have had the political will to discover on its own.
Well, I think it's a great example of scholarship that could have significant practical value if legislatures or bureaucrats would read it and hold industry accountable to it.
So I have a quick question on that incentive-weighted system. Because the question that you pose is which party's transportation selection of behavior, if adopted more widely, would reduce the risk and cost of travel. And so I get it, the example of, say, prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists over drivers of vehicles. But part of my understanding of a strong push for driverless vehicles is precisely because it gives opportunities to individuals who might not otherwise be able to drive. So
yes.
We're talking about people who are mobilely impaired or perhaps cognitively impaired. And so what happens then? So this individual, for example, has a new life opened up to him or her because they can now get into a car and get somewhere, be it the grocery store or a friend's house or whatever it happens to be. So I guess I'm pushing you a little bit on your incentive-based system because I think, the more we push, the more it's going to be hard to justify. So I wonder if you have a response to that.
Well, I think you're right. I think that the way this works in part assumes that people have the option between driving themselves, being driven by a driverless vehicle, or taking a bike or public transportation. But obviously, as you say, and as I discussed at the beginning of my paper, but didn't have an opportunity to in my presentation, part of the real benefit of widespread adoption of driverless vehicles is going to be increased personal independence and mobility for people who can't drive for whatever reason, whether it's age or disability or blindness, for example. And of course, many of them aren't going to be able to cycle or walk either. So to them, it doesn't really provide any incentive because they have one choice. So I think there's a question of how fine-grained of regulation you want to adopt. So the coarsest regulation is the just don't hit anything option, right? And the less coarse regulation is the hit inanimate objects that aren't going to cause damage to a passenger before you hit people or vehicles that have passengers in them. The slightly finer grained one is to consider numbers. And then this is a system that's more finely grained than one that considers numbers of people. But it's not as finely grained as one that also considers what options those people would have had. So what you're suggesting implies, I think, that if you had the opportunity, you might need to consider a more finely grained system, one that does consider what options people had. But I think first of all, I have to say I don't really have all of I don't have answers for all of the scenarios. I think that's a difficult problem, but it's definitely something that I think is left incomplete with this. The other thing that's left incomplete is how much priority should be given. Does one pedestrian outweigh two motorists? Probably not, right? But you could make an argument that like, look, this is someone who wants nothing to do with these very high inertia vehicles that run over people all the time, right? So why should they have to pay the cost and safety for other people's preferences? But yeah, I think that the person who has no option to transport themselves but a driverless vehicle would have a legitimate complaint against this type of system. But I'm not sure how the complaint could be resolved, because I think a pedestrian would also have a legitimate complaint. It might be that if you had the very sort of fine-grained programming, that you would eliminate the prioritization in those cases, and you would just adopt a numbers-based or risk-based calculation. The other thing being that not only, of course, our number is going to be asymmetrical in a lot of instances, but risk of injury is going to be asymmetrical in most cases. So it's usually not going to be a neat, either someone dies or lives, but someone might have, between 30 and 60% chance of death, whereas someone else has a 90 to 98% chance of death. So that's another way of thinking about this from a utilitarian risk distributive mindset. But yeah, I think that's something that I need to think more about. Yeah.
So now continuing to follow up with all these questions, my question will be consistent with other questions that before asked. It is an almost proven fact for me that all the data, the artificial intelligence that is generated, that's generally and most effectively controlled by the tech companies and the programmers, not the government. It's almost proven until now, at least. Because the government has to rely on all these companies further, to share the data. Government can't have those excesses. So it's who owns data? Means the current tech companies own data. So that means the technology has the most controlling thing in the policy making and who makes the decision to what they are doing. So that means most probably, following up with Brooks' thing, the tech corporations will be very controlling actor here, or the programmers, for example. The British government, American governments, they hire these hackers, for necessary purposes. That's how that started too. So the programmers, the individuals, are the tech companies. They will have the control and influence and dictation in the policy making. Most probably. I'm just imagining the way it has taken place right now. Number two, government has a major role. Only one thing that is regulatory role is that if the tech companies cannot come up with a responsible policy making or responsible technology use, then government will be taking action against those tech companies based on the consequences post facto. That is what government can do very well. And very clear, these two things are very clear now. Now in this aspect, what I wanted to learn from you is that in this case, now you said that risky externalities that cannot be offset by motor risks over this.
I'm sorry, I'm having
The externalities that you talked about, externalities. There are two things that I was thinking. One is externalities. What are the externalities? You must have, identified those externalities. In your paper, I haven't read that, so I would like to learn that. What are those externalities? Because that will have identification of those externalities would guide most of the policy decisions in terms of reducing public health and regulatory or normative system. That is one thing. Number two is infrastructure, technological infrastructure and other material infrastructure. For example, there are already there's things, for example, when we're counting the animals, the endangered species and threatened species, or the domesticated animals that counting, that what government uses and individuals, farmers now, at least in the United States, they started using is e-tag. You must be familiar with that. All the animals have e-tags. So they don't have to go and count, it's just a monitor, like our meter reading, utility meter readings, that will just, the sensor and everything will be there. That's one thing that I would not be surprised once the e-cars or the driverless cars already in practice a little bit. When it gets so much, our driver's license will have an e-chip or something like that, that will connect when we are crossing, that will give us some sort of warning, or the car will get some sort of warning. That I would not be surprised if that can even happen. It will be no time, because the e-tag is already practiced. Because that is what I'm saying is, two things. The identification of externalities, what are those? And what kind of technological infrastructures that have already developed are going to be developed? And what kind of other material infrastructures? And the actors. These factors are going to make sure, I think, that have to be factored in or considered in order to come up with the ethical dilemma, do you answer the ethical dilemma? The regulatory aspects, effective regulatory aspects, and making tech corporations responsible for that. So what are those infrastructures, actors, and externalities? How that nexus between these two interconnection in policy making and in making the decision that your two research questions when we started beginning that we introduced. I think that is what we may not have time, but we can discuss later on too. So those are the things that I want to learn a little bit more about that.
Great. So just to make sure that I understand your question, you're asking both what are the externalities around both driverless and manually driven vehicles, and what are the infrastructural solutions to reduce those externalities?
Technological and material infrastructure.
Both. So when you say material, do you mean?
I mean the roads.
Right. Okay.
The traffic.
Yeah.
Lots of other things. The buildings. What is the distance from this to? What are the things that they have to have on the road? And what is the lane? Whatever. All that kind of things. Lots of questions that have to be resolved maybe in terms of driving and vehicles. Yes.
Right. Okay. So I obviously can't list all of the externalities or all of the technological and material infrastructural responses to them, but I think there are a bunch of pretty obvious ones for cars that are reduced if you have very effective driverless vehicle programming. So the most obvious one is 31,000 people in the US died in 2016 as a result of auto accidents. That's the most recent year that we have good data for. If 90% plus of those are caused by human error, then the convenience added of being able to drive your own car, and maybe the entertainment added because it's fun, right? It can be fun, has a major cost in this non-negligible amount of avoidable deaths. Whereas I'm not sure how many people died as a result of cycling collisions or pedestrian collisions, but I'm thinking it's going to be a lot lower than that. The other really obvious one, so that's going to be mitigated not just by advanced driverless vehicle technology, but even by some technologies that we already have but that we aren't using. So we could mandate automatic braking. We could mandate pedestrian airbags, which were briefly attempted, but there was no market for them. So vehicles don't really use those anymore. In terms of the infrastructure, I think Like, again, this is sort of like a way of analyzing how it seems to me the technology is likely to develop according to the society that we're in. So in an ideal situation, you would probably have elevated roads that are just totally segregated from pedestrians, and you would only allow driverless vehicles that are all coordinated with each other, and people who want to drive their own cars can drive them on some closed circuits that are in the desert or something, and then no one would ever die. And you would obviously require every car to be powered by a renewable electrical source rather than fossil fuels. That to me doesn't seem like the most likely way that this technology is going to be introduced. Instead, I suspect that you will have mixed-use roads for many decades where you have both driverless, manually driven, and cyclists and pedestrians sharing the same space. So you could have, I think, very effective material infrastructural solutions to that. You could also have very effective technological solutions that we already have for manually driven vehicles that we just haven't mandated. But then it took a really long time to mandate seatbelts as well. It took a really long time to mandate airbags. Again, like these are, there were a lot of possibilities in those questions.
So thank you so much.